The first time I heard about someone calling themselves an HOA cop, I thought it was a joke. Who even does that? But on our ranch, things stopped being funny real quick. Imagine this: wide open fields, cattle grazing, a creek that runs like a silver ribbon through the land. That's where my family has lived for years. It's quiet, peaceful, the kind of place where you know every inch of the property. Which is why it was impossible not to notice when a strange truck started showing up. At first, we thought maybe the driver was lost. People wander onto ranch roads sometimes, especially if they're not from around here. But then it happened again. And again. The same truck. Parked in the same spot. Sometimes close to the barn, other times right near the gate where Grandpa liked to sit in the evenings. Whoever it was didn't even bother to hide it. They acted like they had a right to be there. One day, a man stepped out. He had a shiny badge clipped to his belt. Not a real one. Just something you could print online or buy at a flea market. He called himself an HOA cop. Grandpa almost laughed in his face. Out here, there is no HOA. This is ranch country. No board of neighbors, no list of rules about how tall your grass can be. But this man carried himself like he had authority. He walked slow, looked around like he owned the place, and told us he was making sure everything was in order. That didn't sit well with Grandpa. You have to understand something about him. He's old school. Raised in a time when a handshake meant something, when you worked hard for what you owned, and you sure didn't let strangers walk all over you. To Grandpa, the land isn't just dirt and grass. It's family. It's years of sweat, years of struggle, and years of keeping it safe. So when this man strutted around pretending to be a cop, Grandpa's patience thinned fast. Still, he didn't blow up right away. He gave the man a chance. Told him this was private land, told him to leave. But the guy just smirked, leaned against his truck like it was his front porch, and said he had business here. That was the moment everyone realized this wasn't some mix-up. He wasn't lost. He wasn't confused. He was deliberately parking on our ranch, making himself comfortable like he owned it. The days rolled on, and the pattern didn't change. The truck would show up. Sometimes early in the morning. Sometimes late in the evening. Always the same spot. Always the same smug look from the so-called cop. We tried to figure out what he wanted. Was he watching us? Was he just trying to annoy Grandpa? Or maybe he thought if he kept showing up, we'd eventually just accept him being there. But if there's one thing you should know about ranchers, it's that we don't just accept things like that. Not when it comes to our land. Grandpa especially wasn't wired that way. Every time the truck appeared, his jaw would tighten just a little more. You could see him thinking, measuring the line between patience and action. And each day, that line got thinner. Finally, there came a morning when the truck pulled in earlier than usual. Grandpa was already outside, leaning on his cane, staring at the horizon. He watched the dust trail kick up before the tires even touched the dirt road. The man parked right near the creek this time. He stepped out like always, flashing that fake badge, pretending like the land answered to him. Only this time, Grandpa didn't bother with words. He walked back toward the barn, calm as ever, and came out carrying a length of heavy chain. The sound of it dragging on the gravel made everyone's head turn. The man must have thought Grandpa was bluffing, because he didn't move. He just stood there, arms crossed, smirking like nothing was about to happen. But Grandpa had made up his mind. He'd warned him enough times. He'd given him every chance to leave. And now, the man's truck was about to pay the price. Grandpa bent down, hooked the chain to the back end of the truck, and tightened it with steady hands. Every movement was slow, deliberate, like he'd been planning this for weeks. Then he climbed onto his tractor, fired it up, and with one pull, the chain went taut. The man's smirk finally slipped as the truck jolted backward. Dust shot up as the tires skidded across the dirt. The creek wasn't far, and Grandpa wasn't stopping. The chain snapped tight, and the old tractor growled as Grandpa pressed forward. The truck lurched, bouncing hard as its tires scraped against rocks and dirt. The man ran alongside, shouting, waving his arms, but Grandpa didn't even look back. The sound of metal grinding against gravel mixed with the roar of the tractor, and for a second, it felt like the whole ranch was holding its breath. Dust curled into the sky as the truck slid closer and closer to the creek bed. The man's fake badge swung wildly as he tried to chase after the truck, yelling that Grandpa couldn't do this, that he had authority. But his voice cracked. There was no confidence left in it now. He had spent weeks pretending to be in charge, pretending the land was his to inspect. But at that moment, watching his truck get dragged through the dirt, it was clear who really had control. Grandpa didn't shout. He didn't curse. He didn't even raise his voice. He just kept moving forward, steady, as if this was just another chore that needed finishing. The truck's front bumper slammed against the edge of the creek. The tires twisted, sinking halfway into the mud as the water splashed up against the side panels. Grandpa didn't stop. He leaned into the pull, and the whole vehicle tilted, screeching as its weight gave way. The man stumbled forward, nearly falling face first as his precious truck slid into the water. The current wasn't strong, but it was enough to swallow the tires, enough to leave the truck stuck halfway, sitting awkwardly in the muddy creek like a giant toy someone dropped in the wrong place. For a moment, silence filled the air. Only the trickle of the water and the creak of cooling metal broke it. Grandpa shut off the tractor, set the brake, and climbed down slowly, wiping his hands on a rag he'd tucked into his pocket. He didn't look rushed. He didn't look angry. He just looked done. Done with the lies, done with the truck, done with the so-called HOA cop. The man's face turned red as he stomped around, pointing his finger, shouting threats about calling the real police, about suing, about making us pay for damages. Grandpa just leaned on his cane and let him rant. Every word the man spat out sounded weaker than the last, drowned out by the sight of his truck sitting helplessly in the creek. The badge that once looked so official now hung crooked, nothing more than a piece of cheap metal clipped to his belt. Without the truck, without the act, he didn't look like a cop anymore. He just looked like a trespasser who had finally been put in his place. The man's boots sank into the mud as he tried to wade closer, shouting that Grandpa had no right. But Grandpa finally spoke, his voice steady and calm. "Son, I told you not to park here. I told you this land isn't yours. You didn't listen. Now your truck's got a new parking spot." That was it. No shouting, no long speech. Just the truth, laid out as plain as the dirt under his boots. The man sputtered, trying to come up with a response, but nothing came out. He looked around like he expected someone else to back him up, but there was no one there. No neighbors, no officials, no board members. Just him, his drowned-out truck, and Grandpa standing tall against the backdrop of the ranch. The longer he stood there, the clearer it became that he had lost. His fake authority had no weight anymore. His truck, the one thing he had used to roll up and intimidate, was ruined, stuck deep in mud and water. He kept pacing, throwing out threats that grew quieter with every minute. Meanwhile, Grandpa just walked back to the barn, calm as if he had simply finished feeding the cattle. The man finally gave up on yelling. His voice cracked into silence, and all that was left was the sound of squelching mud as he trudged toward his stranded truck. He tried rocking it, tried starting the engine, but water had already seeped into places it didn't belong. The engine sputtered, coughed, and went dead. He slammed his fist against the steering wheel, but that didn't change a thing. The sun was dipping lower now, casting long shadows across the ranch. Grandpa stood at the porch, watching without a word, while the man sat slumped behind the wheel, defeated. Every attempt to reclaim control only dragged him deeper into embarrassment. What was once a show of authority had turned into a scene of humiliation. And all of it happened because he didn't respect a simple boundary. He thought a fake badge could give him power. He thought parking on someone else's land would make him untouchable. But here he was, stuck in a muddy creek, his truck chained and dragged there by a man who didn't need a title, didn't need a badge, and didn't need to prove anything. The man sat there in his truck, water creeping higher around the tires, his face twisted with frustration. He slammed the door open and stomped out, his boots sinking deep into the mud with a wet squelch. His pants were already splattered, his hands shaking with rage as he pointed back toward the house. He shouted that Grandpa was going to regret this, that we didn't know who we were dealing with. But the words rang hollow. The ranch stretched out behind us, wide and calm, and his anger looked small against it. Grandpa stood steady on the porch, leaning on his cane, not saying a thing. He had made his point already. The man waved his arms around, threatening lawsuits, talking about fines, about calling people who would handle this. But the truth was right there in the open. He wasn't in control anymore. He was just a man with a ruined truck and a fake badge, shouting into the empty air. Minutes dragged by as he tried to collect himself. He paced back and forth, his eyes darting between the waterlogged truck and Grandpa's calm figure. Every second made it clearer that he didn't belong here. He had been exposed. The act was over. Without the truck, without his false air of authority, there was nothing left for him to stand on. And yet he still tried. He pulled out his phone, waving it in the air like it was a weapon, saying he had connections, and that Grandpa would be arrested. But even his voice shook. The words didn't carry the weight he wanted them to. At one point, he even tried to tug the truck free with his own strength, grabbing at the bumper, pulling until his face turned red. But the mud held it fast, and his hands slipped off with nothing to show for it but a smear of dirt across his arms. He kicked at the tires, cursing loud enough for the echoes to bounce off the hills. The sound of it carried, but it didn't change the truth. The ranch wasn't his. It never had been. Grandpa finally shifted his stance, taking a slow step off the porch. He didn't rush. He walked with the same deliberate calm he always carried, his cane tapping the ground with each step. The man froze for a moment, eyes narrowing as Grandpa approached. But there was no anger in his face, no rush of temper. Just the same steady patience that had carried him through years of ranch life. When he stopped a few feet away, he looked the man straight in the eye and said, "You've had enough chances. Take your badge, take yourself, and leave." The man's mouth opened like he was about to argue, but no words came out. His shoulders slumped, his arms dropped to his sides, and for the first time since he showed up, he looked small. The truck groaned in the creek behind him, water lapping against the door panels. There was no saving it now, and he knew it. His little show of power had sunk with it. He muttered something under his breath, something about this not being over, but even he didn't sound convinced. His voice had lost all the sharp edges it once carried. He turned back to the truck, staring at it like it might suddenly spring back to life, but nothing happened. The only sound was the steady flow of the creek and the low call of a bird somewhere out in the trees. Grandpa didn't say another word. He just turned and walked back toward the porch, every step measured, his back straight. He didn't need to say more. His actions had spoken louder than anything else could. The man stood there, dripping with sweat and mud, caught between pride and defeat. He looked like someone who had wandered into a fight he never should have picked. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky with streaks of orange and red. The ranch glowed in the evening light, calm and untouched, except for the stranded truck sitting awkwardly in the creek. The man finally climbed back inside, slamming the door, pounding on the steering wheel as if anger alone could push the vehicle free. The engine sputtered again, wheezing before going dead completely. He buried his face in his hands, the sound of his own breathing heavy in the silence. Time moved slow, but nothing changed. The water rose just a little higher, wrapping the tires deeper, pulling the truck further into the muck. Every attempt to fight it only made the scene look sadder, more desperate. Grandpa stayed on the porch, arms crossed, watching without expression. There was no need to interfere anymore. The man had created his own downfall, and now he had to sit in it. What had once been a show of power had turned into a picture of defeat. The ranch had rejected him, the land had pushed him out, and Grandpa had made sure the message was clear. The man sat trapped in his own stubbornness, his truck stuck where no badge, real or fake, could pull him free. The evening air grew heavier as the man's truck sat deeper in the creek, water slowly wrapping around the bottom of the doors. The smell of wet mud filled the air, and every croak of a frog in the reeds seemed to mock him. He was still inside, his hands gripping the wheel like it was the last piece of control he had left. From the porch, Grandpa didn't move, just rocking back slightly on his heels, cane planted firm on the wooden boards. The man finally threw the door open and stumbled out, his boots splashing into the water. He waded around the truck, his voice breaking as he tried one more time to convince us that he had jurisdiction. He waved his fake badge in the fading light, but it looked more pitiful now than ever, catching the glow of the sunset like a toy trinket. He kept insisting that we were in trouble, that this was all illegal, that people in high places would hear about it. But the creek didn't care, and neither did Grandpa. With every passing minute, the man's words carried less weight. He wasn't the enforcer anymore. He was just another trespasser, knee-deep in muddy water, trying to hold on to a story that had already fallen apart. His eyes darted around the land as though searching for backup, but no help was coming. Out here, there was no board meeting to call, no neighbors to rally. It was just him against the truth. He made a desperate attempt to push the truck from behind, his shoulder pressed against the tailgate, his boots sliding in the mud. He grunted, strained, cursed under his breath, but the truck didn't budge an inch. The chain still clung tight, wrapped around the axle, every link dug deep into steel. Grandpa's tractor sat parked nearby, engine silent now, like a guard watching over its prize. The man gave up after a few minutes, breathless, clothes soaked, and anger spilling out of him in short bursts. He shouted up at Grandpa, saying he'd call the sheriff. He said property rights didn't allow this, that he knew the law better than we did. Grandpa tilted his head slightly, his eyes steady, and gave a slow shake. Not a word came out of him, but that one motion was louder than any argument. The man froze, realizing how ridiculous he sounded, yelling about laws while standing trespassing on someone else's ranch. The sky darkened little by little, and the hum of crickets filled the quiet. The man kicked at the ground, muttering, trying to gather his pride. But pride couldn't tow his truck out of a creek. Pride couldn't erase the fact that he had been caught in his own game. Every step he took through the mud only dragged him deeper into the mess he'd created. He looked less like a cop now and more like a child who had played with something he didn't understand. At one point, he tried to climb back into the cab, twisting the key in the ignition again. The truck sputtered, coughed, and died, the engine choking on water it could never spit out. He pounded the steering wheel with both fists, screaming words that barely carried through the still night. The sound echoed across the fields, but there was no answer. Only the steady trickle of the creek and the quiet strength of the land around him. Grandpa turned then, walking back inside the house as calmly as he had walked out. The door creaked shut behind him, leaving the man alone with his ruined truck and his fading excuses. From the window, I could see him pacing, rubbing his hands over his face, pulling at his hair. He didn't know what to do next. Every move he made was the move of someone who had run out of options. Minutes turned into an hour. The man stayed by the creek, sometimes yelling, sometimes sitting on a rock with his head in his hands. The night grew darker, the air colder, and his shoulders slumped lower each time I glanced out. The fake badge still hung at his waist, glinting under the moonlight, but it meant nothing now. Nothing could cover the truth that he had been stripped of his little show of authority and left with nothing but a stuck truck and his own mistakes. The longer he stayed, the more foolish he looked. The ranch didn't bow to his demands, and Grandpa didn't waste another word on him. It was a quiet victory, a silent statement that didn't need shouting. Out here, actions mattered more than talk, and one chain had said everything that needed saying. The man lingered by the creek, clutching at the last pieces of a story that no longer made sense, while the night settled heavy across the land, watching him unravel in the shadows. The night stretched on, and the man's figure grew smaller in the distance, swallowed by the shadows near the creek. The truck sat tilted, its front end buried deeper in the mud, the water now licking at the bottom of the doors. The sound of frogs and crickets filled the air, a steady chorus that made the whole scene feel like nature itself was mocking his stubbornness. He still paced back and forth, muttering, sometimes shouting into his phone, sometimes just standing with his arms crossed like he was daring the darkness to answer him. But the ranch stayed quiet, calm, untouched by his noise. Inside the house, Grandpa sat at the table, silent, his face calm, his eyes sharp. He didn't celebrate, didn't gloat. That wasn't his way. To him, this wasn't about winning or proving a point to anyone else. It was about protecting what was his, about drawing a line no stranger had the right to cross. He sipped his coffee like he did every evening, listening to the faint echoes of the man's shouting outside. It didn't disturb him. If anything, it sounded like the last cries of someone who had already lost. Hours passed. The man tried starting the truck again, grinding the key over and over until the sound of the dead engine filled the night. Each failed attempt chipped away at him, his shoulders sagging lower. He stomped through the mud, pulled at the chain, even tried loosening the hook with his bare hands, but nothing worked. The chain was firm, locked in place by Grandpa's steady hands. It wasn't going anywhere until Grandpa decided it would. And Grandpa had no plans of moving it. The man finally sat down on the bank of the creek, his knees bent, his arms resting on them. His head dropped forward, and for the first time, the anger seemed to leave his body. The fight drained out of him, leaving just a figure hunched against the night, beaten not by fists or force, but by his own arrogance. The fake badge that had once given him so much confidence hung dull against his belt, no longer flashing in the light, no longer fooling anyone. The ranch was still, peaceful as ever. The cattle had long since settled, the dogs stretched out by the barn, everything carrying on as though nothing unusual had happened. And maybe that was the most powerful part of it all. For the land, this was just another night. For the man, it was the night everything came crashing down. Sometime after midnight, headlights flashed faintly on the far road. The man perked up, jumping to his feet, waving his arms as if salvation had arrived. But the lights passed by, just another car moving on its way, not interested in his mess. He cursed into the dark, his voice hoarse, and kicked at the mud until it splashed up his pants. His frustration made him clumsy. each movement more desperate than the last. Back at the house, Grandpa didn't move to stop him, didn't call anyone, didn't bother. He knew the man's fight was with himself now. The more he resisted, the more foolish he became. Every step he took in the mud was just another reminder of the hole he had dug for himself. Out here, nobody had to tell him he was wrong. The land itself showed him. The silence, the weight of being out of place, the way his truck sank further into the muck with each passing hour. It all told him what words never could. The man shouted one last time toward the porch, his voice cracking, saying this wasn't the end. But there was no strength left behind it. His throat was raw, his anger burned out. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the dark outline of the house, before turning back to the creek. His truck leaned awkwardly, half claimed by the water, a monument to his mistake. He placed a hand on the hood, maybe hoping for a miracle, but the metal was cold, lifeless, and unyielding. As the hours crawled toward dawn, the first hints of light touched the horizon. The ranch glowed faintly, the fields stretching wide and golden, the creek reflecting the soft colors of the morning sky. The man looked worn, his clothes soaked, his face lined with exhaustion. He had spent the entire night trying to fight a battle he couldn't win. And as the day broke, it was clear he had lost more than just a truck. He had lost the story he told himself, the false authority he wore like armor, and the pride that had carried him onto land that never belonged to him. The morning light revealed everything. His truck stuck fast, the mud caked thick, the badge on his belt hanging useless. And Grandpa, sitting steady on the porch once again, watching without a word, waiting to see what the man would do next. The sun rose higher, spilling gold across the ranch, and every detail of the scene sharpened. The truck looked worse in daylight, streaked with mud, its nose buried deep in the creek. The man stood nearby, his shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow from a night without sleep. His clothes were stained, his boots caked heavy with dirt, and that fake badge hung limp at his side. For the first time, he didn't look like someone pretending to be in charge. He looked like someone who had been stripped of every ounce of pride. Grandpa stepped outside with his coffee, calm as ever. He didn't rush, didn't glare, didn't shout. He just stood on the porch, breathing in the cool morning air, as if nothing unusual had happened. The man spotted him right away and straightened up, forcing his voice to sound stronger than it really was. He called out again, saying the sheriff was on his way, saying Grandpa would be in trouble now. But the words lacked fire. They sounded rehearsed, desperate, like he was clinging to the last piece of his broken story. Grandpa didn't answer. He sat down slowly in his chair, set his cane against the rail, and took a sip of coffee. That silence carried more weight than any argument. It told the man that nothing he said mattered. The land didn't recognize him. The family didn't respect him. And the more he tried to push, the smaller he looked against the wide stretch of the ranch. Minutes dragged by, heavy and slow. The man paced along the creek bank, pulling at his hair, kicking at the mud, glaring at the truck like it had betrayed him. He bent down more than once, trying to free the chain that held it, but it wouldn't budge. His hands slipped, his fingers raw, his temper boiling over again and again. Each time he failed, he grew louder, throwing insults toward the porch, shouting names, threatening every kind of punishment he could think of. But all that noise only echoed across the open fields, fading into nothing. The truck wasn't moving, no matter how much he raged. The water had seeped deeper overnight, locking it in place. The mud had hardened around the tires like cement. He pulled, he shoved, he cursed, but the land had already claimed it. Every desperate effort just made his defeat look clearer. Grandpa leaned back in his chair, watching with steady eyes. To him, there was no need to interfere anymore. The man was already defeated, not by fists, not by yelling, but by his own stubborn pride. The more he fought, the more ridiculous he became. And in the calm of the morning, it was obvious to anyone who saw that this wasn't strength. It was weakness laid bare for all to see. The man finally slumped against the hood of his truck, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. He looked out at the house, his face twisted with a mix of anger and shame. His voice cracked as he shouted that this wasn't fair, that Grandpa had gone too far, that he would make sure everyone knew. But even he didn't sound like he believed it anymore. The words floated weakly into the morning air and dissolved just as quickly. Out on the porch, Grandpa set his coffee down and stood. He walked slowly to the edge of the steps, his cane tapping against the wood. His voice carried across the distance, calm but sharp. "You had plenty of chances," he said. "This is what happens when you don't listen." That was all. No lecture, no long explanation. Just the truth, spoken as plain as the rising sun. The man dropped his eyes, unable to hold the stare. His hands clenched into fists, then loosened again. For a long time, he said nothing. He just stood there, the creek lapping gently against his truck, the badge hanging useless from his belt. The ranch stretched out wide around him, endless and quiet, and in that silence, his defeat grew heavier. The morning wore on, each moment dragging slower than the last. The man's truck sat trapped, his pride drowned, and every move he made only reminded him of the mess he couldn't escape. The land wasn't his. The power wasn't his. And with each breath, it sank in deeper that Grandpa had taken everything back with nothing more than a chain, a tractor, and a steady hand. The heat of the day rolled in, the kind that makes the air shimmer above the fields. The man wiped sweat from his forehead, streaking mud across his skin. His truck looked worse with every passing hour, sagging deeper into the creek as the weight pressed down into the muck. The water lapped lazily at the rims, creeping higher with each ripple, and the smell of wet rust was starting to carry in the breeze. He circled it again and again, muttering under his breath, as if sheer willpower could change the reality in front of him. Grandpa hadn't moved much. He sat steady on the porch, hat shading his eyes, the steam from his second cup of coffee curling into the air. Every so often, he glanced toward the creek, but mostly he let the man wear himself down. That was Grandpa's way. Let people reveal themselves by their own choices. No need to rush, no need to raise a voice. The land always showed the truth. The man's frustration boiled over again. He stomped toward the house, his boots leaving muddy prints across the gravel path. His hands waved wildly as he shouted, demanding that Grandpa unchain the truck, calling him stubborn, calling him crazy. He threw every insult he could think of, his voice sharp and ragged. But Grandpa didn't flinch. He tapped his cane once on the porch rail, steady as stone, and said nothing. That silence cut sharper than any words could. It told the man he wasn't worth the effort of a fight. He stopped halfway up the path, realizing no reaction was coming, and the anger drained out of him in an instant. His arms dropped, his shoulders hunched, and he turned back toward the truck. From where I watched, it was almost sad, watching someone try to puff themselves up only to collapse under the weight of their own lies. That fake badge, the one he had waved like a weapon, swung limply at his side now, glinting weakly in the sun. Every time I saw it, it looked more and more like a cheap toy. The day dragged on. Hours slipped by with the sound of cicadas buzzing in the trees and the steady flow of the creek swallowing more of the truck. The man made call after call on his phone, pacing the bank, raising his voice at whoever answered. He talked about rights, about trespassing, about damages, but the tone of his voice betrayed him. He wasn't in charge anymore. He was begging, trying to sound tough while pleading for help that wasn't coming. At one point, he yanked the badge from his belt and threw it into the dirt, stamping on it with the heel of his boot. He cursed under his breath, his words scattered and broken, his pride unraveling in front of the open sky. For a moment, he stood frozen, staring at what he'd done, before bending down to pick it back up. He brushed it clean and clipped it back on, as if even he couldn't fully let go of the lie. The heat wore him down. Sweat poured from his forehead, dripping into his eyes, soaking the back of his shirt. He sat on a rock by the creek, staring blankly at the truck, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. The fire was gone from him. What remained was a man who had nowhere to go, nothing to show, and no one left to impress. Grandpa rose from the porch then, his movements slow but certain. He walked out toward the barn, the sound of his boots crunching over gravel. The man tensed, watching him, but Grandpa didn't even glance in his direction. He moved with purpose, collected a tool from the wall, and went back about his business. The message was clear. The man wasn't important enough to stop the rhythm of the day. Life on the ranch went on, with or without him. By late afternoon, the sun began to dip, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. The truck looked like it had always been part of the creek now, the mud hugging it tight, the water carrying bits of straw and leaves against its frame. The man leaned against the hood, staring down at the rippling water, his face blank. He wasn't shouting anymore. He wasn't threatening. He was just quiet, worn down to nothing but silence. Grandpa stepped back onto the porch, resting his cane across his knees. He looked out across the land, past the creek, past the man, as if his gaze stretched miles beyond the trouble sitting there. The ranch was steady, untouched, and in that steadiness, the man's failure became undeniable. He had tried to take control, tried to force himself where he didn't belong. But the land had rejected him, and Grandpa had sealed the lesson with one pull of a chain. The man shifted his weight, his head hanging low, his hand brushing against the badge again. He didn't toss it this time. He didn't wave it. He just touched it lightly, as though even he realized now how meaningless it was. The air grew cooler with the coming evening, and with each breath, the truth pressed heavier on him. He had nothing left to stand on, and everyone could see it. The sun finally slid behind the trees, leaving the sky painted in deep shades of purple and gold. The crickets began their nightly chorus, filling the air with a steady hum, while the frogs in the creek croaked, as if celebrating their victory over the truck that now sat half-sunk in their water. The man shifted from one foot to another, clearly restless, but there was nowhere left for him to go. His truck wasn't coming out, not that night, maybe not ever. The creek had swallowed it whole, and his pride along with it. Grandpa lit the lantern by the porch, its soft glow casting long shadows across the yard. He moved slow, deliberate, his cane tapping the boards as he settled back into his chair. It wasn't a triumphant celebration, no raised voice, no gloating. Just the quiet confidence of a man who had protected what was his without ever needing to break a sweat. He didn't even look toward the creek anymore. For him, the matter was done. The land had answered, the lesson had been taught, and that was enough. The man tried one last time to start the truck. He climbed inside, turned the key, and the engine coughed weakly before choking into silence. The sound echoed against the still night air, almost pitiful. He tried again, harder, his fist slamming against the steering wheel, but the creek only gurgled around the wheels in reply. Finally, he stopped, slumping over the wheel, his forehead pressed against it as the darkness closed in. I watched from the steps, the lantern glow flickering on my boots. There was something almost surreal about the whole scene. Hours earlier, he had come onto our land puffed up with false authority, waving that fake badge, trying to intimidate. Now, stripped of all that, he looked small, just another man caught in the mess of his own lies. The creek didn't care about badges, fake or real. The land didn't bend to bluffs. Out here, only truth stood, and truth had a way of humbling even the loudest pretender. Every so often, he glanced toward the house, as if waiting for Grandpa to step in, to offer him help, to give him a way out. But Grandpa didn't move. His patience was infinite, but so was his silence. He had no interest in rescuing someone who had tried to bully his way onto the ranch. If anything, the silence made the lesson sharper. The man wasn't just dealing with a stuck truck, he was dealing with the weight of being ignored, of realizing that no one here saw him as important anymore. The hours stretched. The stars came out one by one, dotting the sky with their quiet glow. The man finally climbed out of the cab, his shoulders slumped, his face pale in the moonlight. He pulled his phone from his pocket, checked it again, and stuffed it back with a frustrated shake of his head. Whoever he had called earlier wasn't coming. No backup. No tow truck. No one willing to step foot onto land that wasn't theirs. Not when the truth about his badge might surface if anyone asked too many questions. He walked along the creek bank, staring at the water, maybe thinking about how deep it was, maybe calculating whether he could salvage anything from that truck at all. The current whispered against the metal, tugging at it, claiming it little by little. Nature didn't rush, but it always finished what it started. Back at the porch, Grandpa leaned back, his hat tilted low. His breathing was steady, his face unreadable in the soft light. To anyone else, it might have looked like he was dozing off. But I knew better. He was listening, measuring every sound, every step. He didn't need to speak, didn't need to lift a hand. The ranch was speaking for him now, and it was speaking louder than any words could. The man stood there for a long while, frozen between pride and surrender. The water lapped at his boots, the night closed in around him, and he seemed smaller with every passing second. The badge glinted once in the lantern light, then vanished into the shadows as he shifted. He no longer waved it. He no longer threatened. It was nothing more than a piece of metal clipped to his belt, useless and empty. The night grew colder, the kind that sinks into your bones. He wrapped his arms around himself, shivering despite the heat that had beaten down all afternoon. Without his truck, without his lies, he was just another trespasser standing in the dark, and the land made sure he felt every ounce of that truth. Grandpa didn't send him away. He didn't need to. The silence of the ranch, the creek swallowing that truck, and the endless sky above did the job better than any words ever could. The man knew he didn't belong here. And slowly, painfully, he began to realize it too.